thank you very much indeed. Let's stay in London though, because we can speak to Nabila Ramdani, a writer on French affairs and a terrorism expert as well, who's in our studio in central London. Nabila, after Charlie Hebdo, was France braced for something like this?
I mean, there was certainly a sense of shock and indeed outrage and anger following the Charlie Hebdo attacks. This was something that, struck right at the heart of the French capital. And we've seen, how it mobilized people who took to the streets to say never again. Marches were organized involving world leaders. But it has to be said that in terms of, the follow-up, in terms of security, it has to be said that the security has remained pretty much relaxed, and there has been a pretty relaxed attitude still as far as security matters are concerned. And this is something that the French government will have an awful lot to answer for, not only because terrorist attacks did happen again, but they did happen again on a much wider scale.
This country has, I think, one of the largest Muslim populations in Europe, also targeted by Islamic State for its strong anti-militant stance right around the world.
Well, yes, indeed, and the very fact that the so-called Islamic State is now claiming responsibility for the attacks and is also saying further that it has encouraged Muslims to hit Paris and indeed France in particular because of its involvement and its strikes over Syria and indeed Iraq, targeting specifically the ISIS targets, will undoubtedly put the 6 million plus Muslims of France under suspicion. And of course, it will lead to people stigmatizing entire Muslim communities for all the wrong reasons. I mean, that kind of attacks that happens in France has nothing more to do with Muslims any more than, the kind of shootings you see, the rampage shootings in America have anything to do with ordinary Americans. So, but that will be undoubtedly a result of the claim by ISIL of these terrorist attacks.
When you think about the rolling, random nature of these shootings last night, speaking to people who witnessed things at the various restaurants and bars we've been at this morning, these gunmen, it seems, walked into waiting cars, having shot 15, 20 more people, and then drove calmly away. We are looking at a very different style of attack, aren't we? With reports from the police saying that 7 of these 8 gunmen, we believe, blew themselves up with suicide belts. The other shot by police. I mean, this is a much bigger, coordinated terror attack than France has probably seen ever before.
Yeah, well, yes, indeed. It is clearly, the worst terrorist incidents in modern France by far. And as you said, I mean, it highlights the sheer barbarism of it all. The very fact that it involves soft targets. It's the easiest thing in the world to attack unarmed civilians with gunfire and indeed explosives. And it just shows that it's also the most cowardly action possible. That there is, people were horrified after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and even that monstrosity has now been overshadowed by the unspeakable barbarism of the latest attacks, as you said, from, what we know, coordinated, involving military weapons, several locations targeted pretty much at the same time. The indiscriminate nature of it all is also a new form of attacks on French soil. You wouldn't associate suicide bombing with the City of Light. Usually you hear about that kind of attacks in devastated countries such as Beirut recently, in Lebanon, or indeed Iraq and indeed Syria. But you wouldn't associate that with a Western capital.
Just one last question, Nabila. I mean, many people will be asking, how on earth do weapons, grenades, explosives actually get smuggled into a city like Paris? Is that because of Europe's increasingly porous borders, or what?
Well, that's a crucial question that is bound to come up you know, in the discussions that François Hollande is going to have, and he indeed has had already this morning, which is, you know, chief of armed forces and very close security advisors. It has to be said that, you know, I've spent a great deal of time in London, but I was born and raised in Paris, and there's a marked difference between the approach to security in the two capital cities. It's much harder to get guns in central London. It's much easier in Paris, and in fact they can be driven in through countries like Belgium or indeed from the east, and weapons are usually paid in cash. So that's, you know, a crucial security issue that will have to be dealt with. There's also a much more relaxed, dare I say, liberal attitude to security matters in Paris than there is in London. For example, there are far less security CCTV cameras in Paris than there is in London. People are very protective about each other's privacy in Paris and tend not to report suspicious activity as much as people would do in London, for example. So there's a whole host of differences in terms of the attitude to security, and clearly there will be a very different feel to Paris from now on, and I think that approach to security will have to change, and the government is acknowledging that.
Okay, Nabila Ramdani speaking to us from London, thank you very much indeed. So, as you would imagine, a sense of disbelief, a sense of shock on the streets of Paris.